It's great to see everybody. I am Julia Sass-Rubin. I'm a professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers. And along with my fellow conference organizers and Rutgers colleagues, excuse me, Charles Payne, Drew Gitomer, Saul Rubenstein, Michael Hayes, and Pengju Zhang, I would like to welcome all of you to the first session of the 2022 Education Policy, Communities, and Social Justice Research Conference. This is actually our 7th annual conference. It's hard to believe. So there will be, in addition to today's session, 3 additional Wednesday afternoon sessions in the next 3 weeks. They will all start at 3:30. Today's session consists of 4 papers on the themes of school discipline, self-efficacy, and school funding. And there will be time for Q&A after the papers are all presented. Each paper will have 15 minutes to present. And because there are so many folks on this Zoom call, I would ask that everyone who's not presenting, please mute themselves if you have not already. I will also ask that you put your question in the chat, and I will call on you to ask it unless you'd like me to just go ahead and read it. I'll go in the order that the questions are submitted after all the papers are presented. So why don't we get started? The first paper today is titled Discipline Patterns Across the Public High School Landscape in a Large Urban District. It's being presented by AJ Ernst. AJ is the head of high school head at Girard College, which is a full scholarship boarding school in Philadelphia for high-performing low-income students. And AJ earned his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania in educational leadership and is a leadership and educational equity policy advisor. And so let me turn it over to him.
All right. Julie, how's that? First of all, thank you for the introduction. How's it looking? Am I sharing the screen correctly?
Looks perfect. All
right. I'm going to do my best to start us off in the right time parameters. I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me join. This is actually, I'm usually used to an audience of adolescents, so hopefully this is a little lighter than my high school students, who I adore. I'm excited about to see the other presentations as well, because I think this has been and continues to be an urgent issue. And as we watch students return from, we'll just say, a really tough 2 years, I think just even in the local context at Girard, we are sitting and really looking at our discipline policy as kids are coming back from a variety of experiences and having a hard time returning to in-person classes. So I'm excited to have to see so many folks interested in this topic. It is a challenging one, and I'm going to just share a project that was sort of the culmination of my graduate studies, where I looked at Philadelphia's school choice system based on some experience I had beforehand. So let's see. So I will try to kind of go through this, sort of where the origin of the question came from. I worked at a charter school in Philadelphia for 8 years, and it was a middle school. And at the end of middle school, students go into this special admissions process where students have to—
John, you know, I need to be able to do A, B, and C. Hold on, let me mute myself.
Oh, okay. I love Zoom. No, right back in. So I worked with students and would sit down with 6th, 7th, and 8th graders and their families to talk about the variety of options of high schools in Philadelphia. And I was not familiar with this. Growing up in New Jersey, there was a school in my town. And so there wasn't, I didn't have much of a context in history, and it became a bit of a passion of mine because watching the disparity between students that would go to a Central, for example, and what that looked like for a graduate compared to when they would go to, say, a Bartram. And the language at the time was not something that I took note of, but the way we talked about schools, and this is a snapshot from a Philadelphia school guide, which is meant to be helpful to inform parents and students about the schools. And these, though, are schools where my former students currently attend. And to see the glaring red, the ones, what that looks like, what that feels like, often created a really tough situation where kids were getting judged on the decisions that they made as they were 12 years old. However, as over time, maybe that was also not the right way to frame it, that the idea we're holding 12-year-olds accountable for larger systemic issues that during my time in graduate school, I started unpacking a little bit more. So what I wanted to look at after a module I took in graduate school around the school to prison pipeline, I was really shocked to, while anecdotally I would hear of violence in a school or suspension rates, to broadly look at two schools, and these two schools actually are located in the same building. And so the jarring difference in school culture within the same space, forget about within the same district, and this is quite common across, certainly in large urban centers across the country, but these broader tracking systems, and then sort of what these experiences look like, and then the results. And I was mostly jarred by the school discipline results, and that became the source of inquiry. So I wanted to take a look at what was going on in Philadelphia across school choice, because that's where I was advising students to go. So I looked at social stratification theory as sort of a conceptual framework, and the bodies of literature I considered and sort of dug into around urban high schools, selective admissions policies, which right now, actually, there's a lawsuit in Philly going on where parents are suing around the special admissions process because they ran out of testing situations this year. So without test scores, families have been scrambling. They instituted a writing analysis this year, and now parents are suing. So this is still and remains a really relevant topic for parents who know how important it is that students go in what we'll say high-performing high schools. So I ran a quantitative study to look at all of the high schools that met the criteria in Philadelphia, and found sort of the major findings. There were these two tracks. There are four types of schools broadly in Philadelphia. You have, your special admissions, which are magnet schools, which there's a history there, but often come with a topic like the Science Leadership Academy. Although, while science is important there, I think special admissions and the themes are less important as much. Just being a high quality school has become sort of central. Then you have citywide, which is a lottery-based system for students in the public school system, similar to the way charters are run, which is another category. And then there's neighborhood schools, which become the de facto last result for Philadelphia students, where if they didn't get into any of the other options, they must go to the neighborhood schools, which in some ways create a reverse funnel for students that have behavior incidents, who have low grades, and those things. If we blame the students, there's a language of, oh, the students deserve that. They don't deserve these resources, rather than, oh, wow, these students actually have the greatest need, and we're actually sending them to a space with the least amount of resources. And the consequences, and what the hope and the aim of the study was, just to look at across the categories of school discipline, what was going on in those categories. And surely there were significant differences between these two spaces. And again, as I sort of referenced earlier, sometimes those can be in the same building, like Ben Franklin High School and SLA. And so that these experiences, there were mass disparities between across. And if you're looking at the screen here, the absenteeism, dropout rate, which are things that are indirectly correlated with, I guess, higher frequency in contact with school discipline, and then direct issues around out of school suspensions, which is what OSS is, expulsions, and then referral to law enforcement. And then the final one is actual arrests that took place at school. And so again, we don't want to see any of these things occurring. It is part of the reality for schools. But when you're looking at an enrollment that's looking at 11 kids that are arrested and 197 in another type of school, clearly there's a glaring disparity around what that looks like and the trauma that is connected to each of those arrests and what that feels like from a school culture. And again, when you look at something like out of school suspensions, just under 300 for special admission schools, and over 4,000, and so I think that affects the larger school culture, the teachers, the community, and this is going on yearly. And these statistics came before the pandemic. And so I think this is something that I would say probably doesn't get better necessarily after the pandemic as well. I don't know that, obviously, but that would be my concern, at least, certainly. So I think part of the conclusion and implications, again, this was I wasn't trying to pursue, a predictive in the sense that if you go to a neighborhood school, you are therefore going to be arrested. That's not what this was about. It's just looking at those relationships. It confirmed a lot of research, really strong, important research about the school to prison pipeline. It was in line with that. I think some of the things that I was looking at in particular is the intersectionality between Black females in school discipline and magnet schools in particular. That group of students were disciplined in a disproportionate percentage in the magnet type. So even though the largest disparity was between, I was looking at school types, in the data, there was a clear trend in special admission schools, which I think add to some really important literature around the intersectionality between being Black and female. I wanted to look at middle school and high school transition because around the feeder aspect of the neighborhood schools, and there was some interesting data around what's going on in the middle school, what discipline looks like there, and then the correlated sort of high school and how those schools all intersect when you're putting different neighborhood middle schools into one high school. And folks who are maybe or have been in Philadelphia for a while has seen when they've combined high schools together, for example, when they were shutting them down, and the violence and discipline that sort of was, reactionary to that. And I wanted to just call attention to the school leadership piece, because I think frequently this is put on principals. And I think that the special admissions is a structure that starts at the top, as far as, and again, parents are certainly a huge stakeholder in this and policymakers, but this is a policy conversation to expect principals with less resources, students coming in with higher needs, to address these discipline issues. It's something that cannot alone be addressed. It's not that principals or other administrators can't be helpful, and obviously teachers play a massive role here, but to expect them to handle all of these issues within a system that is structured to be unequal is an unfair responsibility placed at leaders. And I think that it's an urgent concern, and I'm referencing a term called find your fit. And if you've driven around Philadelphia, it's on billboards everywhere. It's this exciting campaign. And I sometimes am reflective and think that maybe that's a cheap shot to say, oh, I'm criticizing what is this big promotion around, get excited, find your fit. By the district's own assessment, over half the schools are urgent and need urgent intervention. And that's just not from a deferred maintenance standpoint around asbestos, a school academic and disciplinary perspective. So the idea, my question is sort of like, who fits there? And again, when we look at the demographics of that school, I think the question has an answer. But I think until we as a community acknowledge that we shouldn't be advertising that we have 25% really great schools that all of the students should compete for, we shouldn't be advertising that as find our fit. My own personal belief and perspective is that, until all of the schools are adequate and safe and good for all kids, well, now we can talk about which has the arts program and which has the science program. But if find your fit is the difference between going to school where most students go to college and going to a school where most kids have an interaction with the juvenile discipline system, that doesn't feel like something we should be advertising or celebrating and sort of, I think, sugarcoating in a manner that makes it marketing and branding. And so I'll pause there out of respect of time and starting off the tone of going under the 15-minute. But thank you so much for your attention, and I hope that was informative.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, AJ. Yeah, very informative. Okay.
And if I could just add a shout out to Mary Yee, who's here, who got me through my dissertation process in no short form as I tried to finish that in the last year, and she's here. And I just want to give a huge shout out to her. I wouldn't have gotten it done without her.
Congratulations on finishing in the last year. That's while working too. That's not a small feat at all.
Thank you, Julia.
So continuing on the topic of school to prison pipeline and discipline patterns, we have our second paper, which is titled Playtime versus Punishment, Exploring the Preschool to Prison Pipeline. And the authors are Lena Campagna and Angela Murolo. And Lena is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at Caldwell University. She earned her PhD in sociology from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, with a concentration in communities and crime. Angela is a doctoral candidate at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the CUNY Graduate Center. And I will turn it over to them.
Great, thank you. Let me just go ahead and share. Right. Good. Okay, everyone can see well? Good, okay. Yes. So, all right, transitioning from high school now all the way down to preschool and actually daycare centers as well. So what I wanted to start out with, just because as far as the school to prison pipeline, I know that AJ had mentioned that in his presentation and how that is kind of integral to the education system, but really from an early age, which I did not know of. As a criminologist, I was not well versed in the education literature, but this was kind of born out of an experience even that I had with a couple daycare centers in my own life, looking at policies, behaviors that were seen as challenging, and then just knowing the school to prison pipeline and how prevalent it is in, say, criminal justice research, and the school being a primary point where students will, or where youth will have contact with the criminal justice system. Unfortunately, I decided to kind of like delve back further and say, all right, some students don't start school at kindergarten, some start in preschool and in daycare. Is this problem still pervasive? And indeed it was. So what I'll start out by doing is kind of going over that kind of connection with the school to prison pipeline, because that is, when we think about preschool, we probably the farthest thing from, we think of that as sort of the farthest thing from incarceration, right? So, but this connection with school to the criminal justice system, where we see that is pervasive in a lot of the literature and a lot of the empirical studies, as schools, again, being that first point of contact with the criminal justice system, either through school resource officers, through, suspensions, expulsions as well, where students are, say, getting their education interrupted, even as, I mean, I know that a lot of us in here are education scholars and probably know better than I do, but, even 2 weeks in an individual's, education can be a huge interruption. And a lot of the educational training and systems at the juvenile justice facilities are not, up to par, even with our, our institutions, public schools. So we think about the school to prison pipeline, just kind of giving that broader connection, but also for the purposes of this presentation, really going over on how, it starts at the preschool and daycare level. So, okay. So I found some of this research to be, again, quite, I'm not laughing because I think it's funny. I'm laughing because I'm thinking, wow, but we're thinking about preschool, children, right? So ages 3 to 5 are suspended 3 times more than kindergarten through 12th grade combined. So we think about when you think about preschoolers, it's like, what constitutes or what makes somebody say, a risk for suspension or a risk for expulsion? What are these parameters, right? I know they vary by state. They can vary, public versus private, but it was very interesting when I got to see some of the language and what constituted grounds for expulsion or, dismissal in any way, or suspension, interruption in education. And then in Illinois, it's in 40% of childcare centers reported suspending infants as well, which was very interesting, right? You think of an infant, I mean, I got one at home and it's like getting suspended from a daycare facility. What happened there? So again, those children as well who have not turned 3 years old, so toddlers up to 2. So just kind of resonating with that. So why does this matter, right? We think about, okay, yeah, so, we have the school to prison pipeline, and now it's at the preschool level, it always has been at the preschool level. What does that mean? Well, it means a lot, and these are perceptions of school that children or preschool children and toddlers can carry with them, say, throughout their entire education. It shapes the way that one might look at education, right? Interactions with teachers, negative perceptions of school, say if a 3 to 3-year-old is constantly getting, either suspended or told that, they're a bad kid, right? That whole labeling theory, which Angela will be talking about in a little bit. Negative perceptions of school. I don't feel supported here. School is not a place, even before hitting kindergarten, that I feel good, right? I'm again, sort of labeled as a bad kid, a kid who gets suspended, gets kicked out. Also poor impact on establishing peer relationships outside of the family, right? School is a really integral site of how we learn about ourselves and how others view us. So establishing peer relationships and making friends, these policies, right, can really sour that. Also identity formation, again, where do I fit in the world? Sitting as a student, and then also say as a family member, how do others view me, my teachers, my peers? These do have, these policies, suspension policies, and this concept is really pervasive and is very important in, again, identity formation at such an early age, even before hitting, say, the kindergarten. So why is this happening? Well, I looked back to the very few studies that have been done, say, on this particular concept. There's lots out there about the school to prison pipeline. Fortunately, it's being studied a lot, but some of the same themes came up, such as implicit teacher bias, say about certain students, particularly when it came to disparities, say, with students of color, right? That was in this ranged, I mean, that was a pervasive theme, unfortunately, not surprisingly, throughout many of the studies that I looked at. Also, this was the one I found very funny, and even from my own, just interaction with, with the daycare system and preschool system, but interpretations and definitions, right, of challenging or disruptive behavior, right, for a 3-year-old. Say, think about that for a 2 to 3-year-old, 3, 4, 5-year-old, right, I mean, even an infant. Challenging. There are lots of behaviors out there that are challenging, even for my college students. So also lack of resources and, say, training for teachers. You have training for, obviously for educators, but that can vary, say, across, school districts, or whether or not, say, a daycare is publicly funded, privately funded. So just some of the key studies, right? So there is one key study I got to give credit where credit is due. Well, the Yale, the Child Study Center did a really comprehensive study of preschool expulsion policies, right? And this was national, so obviously it's a national, but it's really comprehensive if anybody is really looking to delve into this further after the presentation. But also the 2015 study is really the most recent study on this, on this particular concept with the preschool to prison pipeline. But with Mariana Demu and Hogan in 2015 with the Center for American Progress. And again, that gives like a really big overview and kind of echoes some of the points that, that I did discuss. So in the interest of time, I'm flying through it. Okay, Angela,
Okay.
Now your turn.
Great. So I'm here today to talk about labeling theory. And I think what's most important when talking about labeling theory is to talk about Becker and Lemmert. And so Becker back in 1963 talked about deviance, delinquency, or criminality is actually a consequence of the application of a label by others. And so that includes labels like delinquent, offender, criminal, or someone who's violating any social norms. Therefore, the deviant or criminal or delinquent or offender is one to whom the label has successfully been applied. So one is effectively labeled through the deviant act, or what Lemmert refers to as primary deviance. And then through repeated interactions with people, we internalize those labels and behave according to the labels bestowed upon us. And so that is also called secondary deviance, according to Lambert. So people start to see themselves as others see them. People tend to act on those self-definitions, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. As it's shown here on the screen, my teacher keeps telling me I'm a bad boy. Maybe I am, so I'm going to act in ways that people expect. So of course, this becomes especially concerning in a preschool or learning environment where educators in school settings are is the essential component of socialization, as well as one's development of their concept of self.
Okay, so kind of going into my research, I did do, it's in the process, well, it's in the process of becoming a research project. So it's ongoing. Throughout my content analysis, just on the surface level, what I found. All right, so just in the interest of time, I looked at 42 different daycare policies. These were across the United States and internationally. So also there are a couple daycare policies in Ireland as well that I got my hands on, also in Canada. And so when we're thinking about sort of the scope of the study, those were really the parameters there. I found this through online and also going into actual daycare centers. So in my area in Northern Jersey, so I was able to kind of get sort of both. It includes part-time care facilities too. So I did include, say there were a couple from part-time, daycare centers such as daycare at, fitness centers, other facilities that were not primarily daycare centers. Okay, so what I really wanted to look at was what were their grounds, say, for expulsion or suspension? What, they considered to be, say, challenging behavior, disruptive behavior, right? So now I looked at, here are my I looked at the frequency, right, of these different terms across the policies. Results, so I said thus far, I really want to make that a point, is that it is the thus far of the study. So I looked at, say, expulsion, suspension, but also under behaviors. Biting, hitting, tantrums was another one. So incessant tantrums was also has been a theme that's come up across a lot of different policies, right? Non-payment, right? A lot of these even grounds for suspension and expulsion are on the parents as well. So, on parent behaviors, even physical aggression or abuse towards daycare providers is not good, but that is one that is not in the control of the child. But my big thing here is the responses to challenging behaviors. Safety was another, another term that was across all the policies. Discrimination was only in one of the policies out of the 42, a mention of discrimination, right? That we don't discriminate against, or we in our application of policies, right? As being very, very explicit there. Also, resources in the context of we'll give students resources that they say need, in order to redirect behavior, right? Redirection. I'm sure for the educational scholars out there that it is something that maybe has come up a lot or is a really big theme in early childhood education. And then maintaining a positive environment was another big, say, theme across the various policies. So again, this is something that's very much in the works. But in the interest of time, let me just okay. So for my future research plans, what I want to do is use this as a preliminary analysis and then actually get into interviews with daycare providers on their, say, disciplinary policies, approaches to discipline. I would like to continue with a quantitative analysis, but again, what I just found is sort of a preliminary findings for, again, interviews with daycare providers, and hopefully use this to inform policy, to reach students earlier, right, before they hit pre-K. So I think I am either almost over time or at time.
No, you have several more minutes.
Oh, I thought I had timed myself for, okay, well then, I will actually go back to, all right. So this is good. So in any case, when we talk about reasons for suspension and expulsion, right, we talk about the various, again, reasons why, say, students or preschoolers may be suspended or expelled. Again, non-payment, particularly for private daycares, right? So that's another thing. That's another aspect that's, say, not in the student's control. So again, then not paying or paying late, parents, say, being late to pick up their children. That's another one, say, excessive tardiness. But I found this one, again, to be just very, like, kind of the impetus for my research, right? We're thinking about persistent and challenging behaviors. So again, what constitutes challenging behaviors, right? Is it, in a lot of the policies, it was crying, inability to adjust to the center, right, after a period of time. So, and a lot of these policies did not focus on, say, what that period of time was. Was it, a couple months? Was it a couple weeks? What does it mean to, not be able to, say, adjust to, various, to these settings, right? Which is another, a concept that I found to be interesting, because as we all know that kids adjust, and students for that matter, people adjust faster than others. And again, this particularly with these policies, there was no mention, say, of, how long, if there would be, say, extra time or, extra room for, say, students with, learning disabilities or whatever. So that was another thing that was, again, that I found to be quite interesting. Challenging behaviors with incessant tantrums or outbursts, angry outbursts. So again, so I found that to be just, again, very, very vague. We say incessant, how many times? They didn't really mention that across these policies, particularly for private daycares, because I know that, of course, across the state for public and private, there are certain regulations, particularly in New Jersey. Also threatening behavior, as I said before, from parents or guardians. What is threatening behavior, right? We all can think of examples of overtly threatening behavior, but not necessarily, is it simply talking about their child's behavior a matter, right? So again, these were some of the surface level reasons that kind of really got me interested, right, across the policies. So, okay.
Thank you very much. That's great.
All right.
Bear with me, folks.
Oh, I didn't know if I heard something. All right.
I think people just unmute occasionally. Don't worry about that.
Oh, okay.
It just takes me a second to remute them. So thank you. That was terrific.
Okay.
Do you want to come out of display mode or?
Yes, I will. Hold on. There we go.
Thank you very much, Lena and Angela. So we're shifting a little bit, although still very much in the same theme. The third paper is going to be on affirmative development of students' academic self-efficacy, fosters educational achievement in ethnic minority students. And the authors are May Yuan and Maurice Elias and Gwyne White. And May is a PhD candidate in clinical psychology at Rutgers. Before joining the Social, Emotional, and Character Development Lab at Rutgers, she completed her master's at Teachers College in Columbia. So she's bridging psychology and education, which is very appropriate for this line of research. Maurice is a professor of psychology at Rutgers and the director of the Social, Emotional, and Character Development Lab, also the co-director of the Academy for Social Emotional Learning in Schools. And Gwyne is an assistant professor of psychology at Merrimack College. And I believe May and Gwyne are going to present the paper.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. So as was mentioned, my name is May, and I'm excited to join here with Dr. Gwyne White to present on the affirmative development of students' academic self-efficacy, which we believe fosters educational achievement in ethnic minority students. So before we begin, I just wanted to give an overview of what we'll talk about today. First, I'll introduce some literature on self-efficacy and some other student outcomes, and introduce Latinx youth and talk about affirmative development, which was one of the frameworks that we'll kind of expand upon. And then Dr. White will talk about the current study, including some of the methods, demographics, data analysis, and the results of the study. And then I'll further discuss some of the implications for practice and go over some resources, and we'll answer questions at the very end. So as an introduction, just to introduce the construct of self-efficacy, which is kind of the basis of this presentation. Defining self-efficacy, it is individuals' belief in their capability to produce a desired effect by their own actions. And research has found that individuals with high levels of self-efficacy are more agentic, purposeful, proactive, and more able to regulate themselves to achieve their goals. And some other topics and research, so mental health risk has been found to predict significantly worse academic achievement 3 years later in a sample of elementary age students. So there's kind of that relationship, which we'll also talk about more in our study. And there's also a greater decline in academic functioning for students who displayed psychopathology compared to those that did not. To provide some more context, I'll also talk a little bit about disparities. So there are many disparities, as you all know, in the US educational systems from students from minoritized backgrounds. And this includes differences in qualities of opportunities to learn. And in addition to these external systems, which other presentations also talked about, where their structures are unequal that cause students to experience, there's also experiences of internalized oppression and decreases in confidence in academic settings. And this causes students to feel demeaned with little hope for their status in society changing in terms of their future prospects. And that causes academic disengagement. And as many of you know, this is a pervasive problem in many US school systems. Transitioning also to Latinx youth, this is the predominant sample in the study that Dr. White will introduce. So the Latino population is over 12.5% of the total population in the United States. And it is also the largest ethnic minority group in the US, and it's growing rapidly. Latino children also disproportionately make up the largest percent of children living in poverty in the US. So about 35% of children living in poverty, which translates to about 5.6 million children. That's kind of to give you an estimate. And we found that there's less opportunities for Hispanic youth to develop their full potential due to the external as well as internalized oppression that I mentioned. Another framework that I'll introduce on which the study is kind of expands upon is affirmative development. And I want to introduce Dr. Edmund Gordon. He is a scholar who founded Teacher College's Institute for Urban and Minority Education. And the perspective of affirmative development is one that emphasizes the creation and enhancement of competence in students. And there's a belief that the ability to learn is something that can be learned rather than a fixed aptitude. And he started a research program, the Affirmative Development of Academic Ability, which assumes that abilities are developed through pedagogical and social interventions. And ultimately, it's very important to instill these attitudes in youth to instill self-efficacy. So now I'll turn it over to Dr. White to discuss the study that expands on some of these topics.
Okay. So the study that this is kind of grounded in is looking at the relationship between student self-reported mental health risk. So that's kind of a global assessment of how many risk factors around mental health are students endorsing, as well as their general sense of their own self-efficacy. So this is a kind of global sense of how agentic they feel, how capable they feel of kind of managing and overcoming, as well as measures of student achievement. So GPA and English language. So the school that this study was conducted in is a high school, and it is in a particularly low resourced, high needs school district. At the time of this study, it was one of the schools designated as a failing school by the kind of nomenclature of that time. What that means is that it had a very high dropout rate, roughly about 50%, and was producing test scores, standardized test scores, in the range of kind of the 15th percentile, so the lowest 15th percentile in the state. The school system was, the school represented about 1,400 students, of whom about 1,100 were Latinx, so about 83% of the sample was identified by the school as of Hispanic origin or Latinx. And then of these students, 93% qualified for free or reduced lunch. And this is a metric that kind of also is reflective of the overall school, which is one that kind of is a proxy for socioeconomic status, because students can only receive free or reduced lunch if they are at a percentage of the poverty rate. So what you're looking at really is the school in which this research was conducted was a very kind of low performing and low resource school. And how we did these analysis was via structural equation modeling. So looking at the constructs and how they interacted with each other. So the constructs of interest in this study were self-efficacy. So again, it's that kind of general perception of one's ability to achieve in the face of setbacks, as well as just sort of general perception of one's agentic abilities. When we looked at mental health, we did it through a screener, so a sort of non-diagnostic checklist in which students identified whether or not symptoms of mental health risk, so internalizing, externalizing, and attention, were reflective of their experiences. We also, from the school records, took their unweighted GPA for the school year, as well as their final language arts grade. And we also included in the model a couple of the covariate, specifically academic support. So that was whether or not they were receiving language support or were on a 504 plan, their gender, which at the time was male versus female, and then their grade level, 9th, 10th, 11th, or 12th grade. And so what the study did was look at kind of an overall model of relationship between the factors. And the overall model fit was very good. So what it found was that there is a partially mediated relationship between mental health and academic achievement by self-efficacy. And what this means is that mental health risk, so higher symptom ratings of mental health, were negatively related to academic achievement even after controlling for the covariates. But that when perceptions of self-efficacy were introduced into the model, this partially mediated this relationship, meaning that students with higher rates of self-efficacy were buffered against the negative impact of symptoms of mental health risk on their academic achievement. So that's both GPA and language arts grade. And so this gives us kind of a good model for understanding how there can be an impact of these non-cognitive factors on cognitively measured outcomes. So one of the kind of things that May grounded us in is this idea that many ethnic minority students are missing opportunities to develop to their full potential due to current as well as historical inequalities. And that when we kind of ignore those factors and don't look at resilience, we're just kind of measuring the same things over and over again. One of the things that we looked at was in this very low-resourced, high-risk school of predominantly Latinx youth, self-efficacy was a protective factor. It was predicting academic school success as well as supporting preventing the negative relationship of negative mental health on academic achievement. So when we think about this, we then need to think about that big picture of considering frameworks to promote this resilience factor within the school system and within students. May, it was all on you again. Feel free to unmute.
So as Dr. White mentioned in the previous slide, one important implication is that it's imperative to consider frameworks to promote development of self-efficacy in further programming within the school system, since, as we discussed, academic competence is something that's not fixed, but something that can be developed. And one framework or program in light of this is Comer's School Development Program, and it began with psychiatrist James Comer and the team at the Yale Child Study Center to close the achievement gap. And the core belief is that children need to believe they can learn in order to be successful at learning. And there's structural elements such as 3 teams, one through the parents, the school, and student and staff support, and school planning and management. And of importance is a mental health team that discusses school culture to promote respect, and also programs that explicitly target students' academic self-efficacy and engagement. For example, Comer recommended artistic and social programming to be prominently incorporated within the curriculum so that students who have trouble with other subject areas can experience competence in other spheres, and it helps students to see themselves as competent and efficacious. And so the idea that focusing on students' potential and strengths rather than their weaknesses can allow students to engage themselves in those areas first, and then later in other academic spheres. Another model which draws on Native American traditions is Brenshaw's Circle of Courage perspective. And the idea is that youth empowerment can be cultivated through development of different areas such as belonging, mastery, independence, and generosity. So I'll just briefly mention each of those. So belonging, the idea that youth want to feel included in an environment where they feel safe and that they can trust other individuals. mastery. So the idea that they can develop competence in certain areas of interest to them, and that they can cultivate their talents, independence. So they have having a sense of self-control, being able to assert themselves, being able to scaffold increasing amounts of just independence, and also generosity. So thinking about developing a purpose beyond the self, emphasizing empathy and kindness. So the idea is that in order to thrive, young people must have opportunities to experience each aspect of the circle. So lastly, the social, emotional, and character development perspective is another way to conceptualize these programs. So for the interest of time, I won't go too much into SECD, but research shows that SECD programs cultivate students' social, emotional, cognitive skills, character virtues, and self-efficacy. And as you mentioned earlier, self-efficacy is mutable and it can be improved through directed interventions. So that's very important. And yeah, so in light of educational policy, it's important to emphasize programs that are shown to focus on students' social emotional development and self-efficacy to help all students to thrive. So here are some resources if you're interested in learning more, and here are some of the references. And yeah, we'll take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, our final paper today is on the effects of weighted student funding reform on school level spending patterns, teacher resources, and academic achievement. And this is based on New York City. The authors are Youngwan Song and Ross Rubenstein. Youngwan is a doctoral candidate in the Public Management and Policy Department of the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies at Georgia State University. And Ross is a professor and the Distinguished Chair in Educational and Community Policy in the same department, and a faculty fellow with the Georgia Policy Labs in the Andrew Young School of Policy Studies. And so let me turn it over to Youngwan. And I just want to remind everybody to please go ahead. If you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat, and we will start with that after this paper is presented.
Okay, hello. Can you hear my voice? Okay.
Yes, very well.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Youngwan Song, a doctoral candidate in the Andrew Young School of Policy Study at Georgia State University. Today, I present the paper about the effect of weighted student funding reform in New York City. I have worked on this project with my advisor, Dr. Ross Rubenstein. So far in the United States, the school finance reforms have given the limited attention to the resource disparity across the school within a large school district. So to handle this problem, about 27 large school districts have implemented weighted student funding system as a budgeting reform. However, despite the growing number of these reforms, there is a lack of the evidence of the comprehensive effectiveness of this new system. So this paper attempts to provide the causal evidence from the New York City's reform case, and then we provide the policy implication for the potentials and limitation of the weighted student funding system. Then what is changed by the weighted student funding reform? So the traditionally school district determine the individual school budget by staff position and the district-wide average teacher salary. However, under the weighted student funding system, the school budget determined by the weighted enrollment and the per pupil allocation. Here, the various need weights are used in this formula. So money follows not staff position, but student needs. Following these general features, the New York City started their own version, the Fair Student Funding System, since 2008. Their new formula has two major parts. The first one is foundation allocation. This is a fixed amount for all schools. And the other part is determined by the weighted enrollment and per pupil allocation. The city used various need factors such as grades, achievement level, poverty, English language learner or special education. And another big feature of this new system is the full discretionary fund, which means individual schools, they can use this funding at their needs. However, at the beginning, this system had some limited implementation. There were 2 phase-in provisions by 2012 because the schools who overfunded before the reform, they kept receiving the same level of a budget in the previous year because to prevent the critical budget shock by this new formula. And the other schools who underfunded in the old regime, they did not receive the full amount of the budget that the new formula determined. So this is a phase-in provision. And another issue is, as we know, the Great Recessions affected the old district-wide budget for 3 years until 2012. About this fair student funding system, the literature tells us and helps us define this new system as decentralized school-based management or school-based budget system. And the evidence from the literature shows that there was improvement in the vertically equitable funding in a budget level during the first 5 years after FSF adoption. However, little is known about the reform-induced changes in school-level spending patterns and teacher resource, and ultimately academic performance beyond the phase-in and also Great Recession period. To examine this effect of the reform, we develop a logic model to answer how did schools responded to the reforms. So we expected once FSF system adoption, then underfunded schools mostly got additional funding and discretion. So they would use this additional revenue for more spending for instruction and also more qualified teachers. And we could expect in the end, ultimately, maybe the school level academic performance is also affected by this change in resource. So this is our logic model. So in other words, this paper answered this research question. To what extent have underfunded schools changed spending patterns, teacher resource, and academic achievement, given additional funding and discretion since the FSF adoption? To answer this research question, we collected a lot of data from publicly available data sources to make the school year balanced panel data that covers the 14 years from 2004 to 2017. So this sample includes the 331 elementary schools and 77 middle schools and 88 high schools. These are measures that we use and also constructed from that data set. There are 3 major groups of dependent variables for expenditures, teacher resource, and academic achievement. And because of New York City, the spending data is very rich. So we make very detailed spending levels dependent variables. And also we have the covariate for school level demographics. We conducted quasi-experiment design for the difference in differences and event study model, running that extended 2A fixed effect panel data regression, and also this regression control for covariate specific outcome trend and covariate specific treatment effect. To estimate the unbiased treatment effect, we need 2 major assumptions. The one is no anticipation assumption and a parallel trend assumption. So we assume the treatment group schools, they didn't change their behavior prior to the reform. That is no anticipation assumption. And the second one is the trends in outcome variables between the treatment and comparison groups should be parallel if there was no reforms. And our event study model can test these 2 assumptions. For the difference in difference framework, our treatment group is underfunded schools that receive additional funding under FSF, but as I said, not as much as the new formula dictates. And our comparison group is overfunded schools that would have lost funding, but they still had harmless and received the same level of funding as in previous year before the reform. To determine these two groups, I used the phase-in fair student funding allocation in 2008. So bottom and top quartiles of that allocation identify these treatment and comparison groups. So these two regression the function is the 2A fixed effect models. So here, the alpha DD is the difference in difference estimate of interest. It is from the treat interaction term between the treat dummy and post dummy. The treat is a dummy for the treatment status, and post is a dummy for the years after 2007. And here's event study models. We replace the post dummy to individual year dummies. So these the coefficient indicate the difference in difference effect relatively to our reference year 2004. So these beta event coefficients should be 0 before the reform, which indicate no anticipation and parallel trend. After the reform, these beta event coefficient should be statistically significantly different from 0. Okay, so these are the major findings from the primary analysis. The numbers in this table are all the statistically significant and also all the supported by the parallel trend assumption. I just picked that major coefficient. So as we can see here, the underfunded middle and high school, they got significant additional revenue, and they spend the spending for classroom instruction and teacher course. So as a result, they changed their teacher resource. They improved their teacher resource, decreasing the less experienced teachers and increasing teachers with a master's degree, and also decrease in the pupil to teacher ratio. On the other hand, underfunded elementary school, they didn't get significant revenue effect, the spending effect. However, it seems they voluntarily decreased the instructional support area. And then they use that money to improve teacher resource. Here, we observed they also decreased the less experienced teachers and increased the teachers with a master's degree, and also they increased the average school level average teacher salary. Even though we have this significant effect on spending and teacher resource, there's no academic achievement effect on the underfunded schools. However, there is a reason why we do not observe the difference effect. These are figures to show the mean trends in the Z scores of 4th grade, 8th grade, and English standardized test for the both groups. As we can see here, after 2007, the both groups, the standardized test scores increase. So which means there is no difference effect on the specifically underfunded schools. But it seems these reform affect both groups' achievement level positively. And beyond this primary analysis, we conducted 2 more supplementary analyses to check the robustness, the estimate. The first one is we used different treatment groups. We used the high need and low need schools. The treatment group is a high need and control group is low need, using the New York State similar school code. So we make the different sample and then conducted same analysis. However, the result is a weakened or disappeared effect. In elementary and high school, there's no effect on all our measures. However, the middle schools, high need middle schools, they got the significant spending effect, but they used that money for instructional support area, not classroom instruction, which means they did not change the teacher resource and also academic achievement. The second supplementary analysis, we used another way to identify the treatment status using the New York City, all schools is a treatment, and non-New York City is our comparison group. So in this case, we observed, interestingly, significant teacher resource effect and significant achievement effect all level of schools. So this indicate the reform affect the teacher resource and academic achievement in general across the schools in New York City compared to non-New York City schools. So the evidence so far suggests some three major stories. So from the primary analysis, the evidence suggests that once the FSF system adoption, the new system led the underfunded schools to improve their teacher resource and also their spending for instruction area. But there is no specific further impact on the underfunded schools, the academic performance. And from the second analysis, the FSF system did not make a similar effect on the high-need schools. That give us the very important policy implication I will discuss later. And from the third analysis, we observed the FSF system adoptions caused the New York City schools improved teacher resource and academic performance in general. So what is the policy implication and what is the point that for the future research? So first one is the weighted student funding itself still matter because we did not observe underfunded elementary school, they didn't get significant spending effect compared to middle and high school, which means we can raise a question about the formula. Why the formula did not make same outcomes in specific elementary schools? And second one is the weighted student fundings, the target population, target schools still matter because we observed underfunded schools and high-need schools, they got the different research outcomes, the finding, which means in these systems, underfunded school is not high-need schools. So we need to develop more accurate definition of the target school for this system. The third one is we observed differential responses to the reform. We observed underfunded elementary school, they changed teacher resource without additional funding, but high-need middle school did not change teacher resource even with additional funding. So these raise a question why they respond to the reform differently. So that's for the future question, for future research and also policy implication. And the last one is the way to improve the performance. We observed the control group schools also improve their achievement because there is a discretion. So maybe the greater discretion more efficient than additional funding. Or we could say, even though underfunded schools, they got additional funding, but they did not make further improvement in academic compared to the comparison group, that is non-effective use of that additional extra money. So these are all the points that we can make some policy implication. So we hope this paper promoting the evidence-based discussion of the weighted student funding's effectiveness. Thank you.
Great.